Homeless boy decides to share his last meal with a stranger on the street. The next day, a limousine pulls up in front of him, and he has an unforgettable Christmas Eve. The streets of Boston were frigid, the kind of cold that sliced through layers of worn-out clothing like shards of glass. Jacob, a boy of no more than 14, huddled beneath an old, patched-up blanket on the steps of a closed diner. His hair was tangled, his face smeared with dirt, and his stomach churned with hunger that had become as familiar as the gray skies above. In his hands was a sandwich, peanut butter and jelly, neatly wrapped in wax paper. It was the last thing he had to eat, a gift from a kind passerby earlier that day. Jacob knew he should save it for later, but the gnawing in his belly was insistent. As he unwrapped the sandwich, the sharp sound of boots on pavement caught his attention. A man, no older than his mid-30s, shuffled toward him. His clothes were tattered, his coat too thin for the weather, and his eyes, deeply lined and tired, were fixed on the ground. Jacob felt a pang of guilt. The man's expression reminded him of his mother's face before she passed. Worn, defeated, but somehow still kind. "Hey," Jacob called, his voice timid but clear. The man stopped, startled, and looked up. "You hungry?" The man hesitated, his sunken cheeks and hollow eyes betraying his pride. "I'm fine, kid. You keep it." Jacob shook his head and held out half of the sandwich. "I can't eat the whole thing anyway," he lied. "Come on, take it." For a moment, the man just stared, the air between them heavy with unspoken gratitude. Finally, he took the half sandwich with trembling hands and nodded. "Thank you," he whispered. They sat together in silence, sharing what little they had. When the sandwich was gone, the man stood, still clutching the wax paper as if it were a treasure. He looked at Jacob, his voice breaking. "You're a good kid. Don't lose that, no matter what." Jacob nodded, offering a small smile, and the man shuffled away into the night. Jacob didn't think much of it afterward. It wasn't the first time he'd shared what little he had, and it likely wouldn't be the last. The next morning, Jacob was woken by the growl of an engine. Groggy, he rubbed his eyes and froze as a sleek black limousine pulled up to the curb in front of him. The window rolled down, and the same man from the night before leaned out, looking vastly different. His hair was combed, his coat now thick and tailored, and his expression was resolute. "Get in," the man said, his voice firm but warm. Jacob hesitated. He had spent years learning to trust no one, yet something about the man's tone, and the memory of his tired eyes, made him stand. The driver opened the door, and Jacob climbed into the luxurious warmth of the car. "Where are we going?" Jacob asked, clutching his tattered blanket. The man smiled gently. "Somewhere you'll be safe. Somewhere warm." As the limousine pulled away, Jacob's heart raced. Suspicion, hope, and fear tangled within him as he looked out at the snowy streets. He didn't know what awaited him, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. The possibility that tomorrow might be better than today. The limousine cruised silently through the snow-dusted streets of Boston, its interior cocooning Jacob in an almost otherworldly warmth. He sat stiffly on the plush leather seat, gripping his tattered blanket like a lifeline. The man from the night before sat across from him, studying Jacob with a soft but serious expression. "What's your name, kid?" the man finally asked. "Jacob," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nice to meet you, Jacob." "I'm Matthew," the man replied, offering a hand. Jacob hesitated before shaking it, noting the strength and warmth in Matthew's grip. As they crossed into a quieter part of the city, the towering buildings gave way to modest suburban homes. The streets felt calmer here, almost serene compared to the chaos Jacob was used to. He couldn't stop himself from asking, "Why are you helping me?" Matthew leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he said after a moment. "And sometimes, all it takes is one act of kindness to change someone's life." Jacob didn't reply, unsure of what to say. His instincts warned him to be cautious, but Matthew's words stirred something within him. A fragile hope he thought had died long ago. The limousine came to a stop in front of a small, neatly kept home with a pale blue door. A soft glow poured from the windows, casting a welcoming light onto the snow-covered driveway. Matthew opened his door and motioned for Jacob to follow. As they approached the house, the door swung open, and a woman stepped out. She was in her late 30s, her auburn hair tied back in a loose ponytail, her eyes warm and kind. "Matthew," she greeted, her voice tinged with relief. "You're back." "This is Jacob," Matthew said, gently guiding the boy forward. "He'll be staying with us for a while." Jacob froze, unsure of what to do. The woman crouched to his level, her smile genuine. "Hi, Jacob. I'm Claire. You must be freezing. Let's get you inside and warm you up." The warmth of the house was almost overwhelming. The faint smell of pine and cinnamon lingered in the air, and the soft hum of a heater created a comforting backdrop. Jacob's eyes darted around the cozy living room, taking in the decorated Christmas tree, the neatly arranged bookshelves, and the crackling fireplace. Claire handed him a mug of steaming hot cocoa. "Drink up. It'll help," she said. He wrapped his hands around the mug, savoring the warmth. It had been so long since anyone had cared for him like this, and he didn't know how to respond. "Thank you," he mumbled. Matthew and Claire exchanged a look, one that Jacob couldn't quite decipher. Then Matthew spoke. "Jacob, I don't know your whole story, but I can guess it hasn't been easy. You don't have to tell us anything you're not ready to. But Claire and I want you to know that you're safe here. No strings attached." The sincerity in Matthew's voice disarmed Jacob. He nodded slowly, his throat tightening with an unfamiliar emotion. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe just a little that he might have found a place where he belonged. That night, Jacob slept in a real bed. The sheets were soft, the blankets heavy, and the pillow cradled his head like a cloud. As he drifted off, a single thought echoed in his mind. This can't be real. But when he woke the next morning to the smell of breakfast and the sound of laughter, he realized it was. For the first time in a long time, Jacob felt the stirrings of something he thought he had lost forever. Hope. The smell of bacon and freshly brewed coffee wafted through the house as Jacob stirred from the deepest sleep he'd had in years. At first, he panicked. This wasn't the cold, hard street corner he was used to. Then the events of the previous day rushed back. The limousine, Matthew, and the warm bed were all real. He sat up slowly, running a hand through his tangled hair, and glanced around the small but cozy room. A soft knock on the door startled him. "Jacob," Claire's voice was gentle. "Breakfast is ready. Come down whenever you're comfortable." For a moment, Jacob hesitated. Years of being on his own had taught him to be wary of people who seemed too good to be true. But something about Matthew and Claire felt different. With a deep breath, he stepped out of the room. The dining room was bright and welcoming, the morning sunlight streaming through lace curtains. Matthew sat at the head of the table, reading a newspaper, while Claire hummed a soft tune as she poured juice into glasses. A plate piled high with scrambled eggs, toast, and bacon sat at the center of the table. "Morning, champ," Matthew greeted, setting down the paper. "Grab a seat. Claire makes the best scrambled eggs in Boston." Claire laughed. "That's a bit of an exaggeration. But thank you, Matthew." Jacob sat cautiously, his eyes darting between the two. He didn't know when he last had a proper breakfast, or any meal he didn't scrounge up himself. He reached for a piece of toast but paused, glancing at Claire for approval. "Help yourself," she said warmly. As they ate, Claire and Matthew asked him casual questions, his favorite foods, if he liked movies, how he spent his time. They didn't press him about his past, and Jacob was grateful for that. By the time breakfast was over, he felt a little more at ease. Claire began clearing the table. "Jacob, there's a shower upstairs, and I left some clean clothes on the counter for you. I hope they fit." "Thanks," Jacob said quietly, unsure how else to respond to such kindness. As he climbed the stairs to the bathroom, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease gnawing at him. What did they want from him? Why were they being so kind? His reflection in the mirror caught his eye. A thin, scruffy boy stared back at him, his eyes filled with suspicion and guarded hope. Later, Jacob found himself sitting with Matthew in the living room. The fire crackled warmly, and a chessboard sat between them. "Ever play?" Matthew asked, gesturing to the board. Jacob shook his head. No, I don't know how. Matthew grinned. Perfect. I'll teach you. As Matthew explained the rules, his tone was patient, and his movements unhurried. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Jacob felt like someone saw him, not as a burden, but as a person worth knowing. That evening, after dinner, Jacob sat alone by the fireplace. Claire brought him a blanket and a cup of chamomile tea. Take your time, Jacob, she said softly before leaving him to his thoughts. Staring into the flames, Jacob's walls began to crack. The memories he had worked so hard to suppress came flooding back. His mother's laughter turning to coughs, her hands slipping from his as she grew weaker, and the cold loneliness that followed her death. Jacob tightened the blanket around himself and wiped his eyes roughly. He wasn't ready to trust completely, but something about this house, about Matthew and Claire, felt safe. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to whisper a wish into the stillness of the room. Please, let this last. The days passed with a comforting rhythm in Matthew and Claire's home. Jacob gradually eased into this new life, though he still carried the weight of his past like a heavy backpack he couldn't set down. The kindness in the house was unrelenting, and yet, in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered warnings. Don't get used to it. Nothing good lasts. One evening, after dinner, Matthew found Jacob sitting on the porch steps, gazing at the stars. The sky was clear, the air crisp, and a silence hung between them that Matthew decided to break. You've been quiet, he said, sitting down beside him. Jacob shrugged, pulling the blanket Claire had given him tighter around his shoulders. I'm just not used to all this, he admitted, his voice barely audible. It's weird, Matthew chuckled softly. Weird good or weird bad? Both, I guess, Jacob muttered, glancing sideways at him. Why are you helping me? You don't even know me. Matthew leaned back, letting the cool air brush against his face. When I was your age, someone helped me, he said, his voice calm and reflective. I was in a rough spot too, but this man, he didn't ask me why or how I ended up there. He just helped, and it changed my life. Jacob looked at him, his skepticism softened by curiosity. What did you do after that? Matthew smiled, his eyes distant as if recalling a memory. I promised myself that if I ever had the chance, I'd pay it forward. Jacob didn't know how to respond. He had spent so long expecting the worst that accepting genuine kindness felt foreign. He stared at the stars, the faint warmth of Matthew's words settling somewhere deep within him. The following morning, Claire suggested they visit a local thrift store. You need some warmer clothes, Jacob, she said, her tone light but insistent. Boston winters don't play around. Jacob hesitated, but Claire wouldn't take no for an answer. She led him through rows of sweaters, jackets, and scarves, always deferring to his preferences. When they returned home with bags of clothing, Jacob was overwhelmed. Not by the items, but by the effort she had put into making him feel cared for. That afternoon, while sorting through the clothes in his room, Jacob came across a small journal tucked into one of the pockets of a second-hand jacket. The leather cover was worn, the pages yellowed, and it had the faint scent of old paper. Intrigued, he flipped it open to find it blank. Later that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Jacob sat by the fireplace and picked up the journal again. He stared at the empty page, unsure why it felt so significant. Then, as if compelled, he began to write. Not much, just a few words. I'm not sure what I'm doing here, but for the first time in a long time, I feel safe. He set the journal aside and stared into the flames. For once, the voice in his head that told him to run, to doubt, was quiet. Over the next few weeks, Jacob became more comfortable in the house. He helped Claire in the kitchen, learning how to chop vegetables and bake cookies. He played chess with Matthew, finally winning a match after countless tries. And on one snowy afternoon, he even ventured into the backyard to build a lopsided snowman, laughing when Claire placed a carrot upside down for the nose. But it wasn't just the routines that changed Jacob. It was the way Matthew and Claire treated him. They didn't press him for answers about his past, didn't demand gratitude or obedience. They simply showed up every day with patience, understanding, and a quiet persistence that chipped away at his defenses. Still, Jacob couldn't fully shake the feeling that this life was temporary, that something would come along to snatch it away. And so, even as the days grew brighter, a shadow lingered in his heart. One evening, as they sat around the dining table, Matthew brought up Christmas. "It's only a week away," he said. "I was thinking we could go pick out a tree tomorrow." Jacob froze. He hadn't celebrated Christmas since his mother passed. The thought of it now felt both thrilling and terrifying. "I don't know," he said, fidgeting with his fork. "Come on, Jacob," Claire encouraged. "It'll be fun. We'll get cocoa afterward, and you can pick the ornaments." Matthew leaned forward with a grin. "And if you don't like cocoa, Claire makes a mean cider." Jacob couldn't help but smile at their enthusiasm. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let's do it." The next day, they bundled up and drove to a tree farm on the outskirts of the city. Jacob's breath formed small clouds in the frosty air as he wandered among the rows of evergreens. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of excitement, pure, unguarded joy. "This one," he finally said, pointing to a sturdy, full tree with bright green needles. "It's perfect," Matthew laughed. "Good choice, kid." As they loaded the tree onto the car and headed home, Jacob stared out the window, a small smile playing on his lips. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to believe that good things could last. But fate, as always, had its own plans. The Christmas tree stood proudly in the living room, its branches adorned with strings of lights, mismatched ornaments, and a star that tilted slightly to one side. Jacob found himself drawn to it, often sitting nearby, mesmerized by the twinkling lights. For the first time in years, the season felt magical, not like the hollow ache it had been since his mother's passing. Matthew and Claire kept busy preparing for Christmas, their warmth infectious. Yet, as the days passed, Jacob's unease began to grow. It wasn't any one thing but a feeling, like an approaching storm. On Christmas Eve morning, Jacob awoke to the sound of voices downstairs. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was tense. Slipping out of bed, he crept down the stairs and found Matthew in the doorway, speaking with a man dressed in a heavy coat and scarf. The man's face was partially obscured, but there was no mistaking his rigid posture. Jacob lingered out of sight, his heart pounding. "Who is he?" he wondered. "You have no right." Matthew's voice was firm but controlled. "I have every right," the man interrupted, his tone sharp. "I'm his father." Jacob's blood ran cold. His father, a man he hadn't seen or heard from since he was 6 years old. The memories of shouting matches, slammed doors, and the night his father walked out flooded back with such force that Jacob had to grip the banister to steady himself. Claire appeared in the hallway, her hand on Matthew's arm. "Let's talk inside," she said softly, glancing toward the stairs as if she sensed Jacob nearby. Reluctantly, Matthew stepped aside, allowing the man to enter. Jacob darted back up the stairs, his heart racing. He shut the door to his room and pressed his back against it, struggling to breathe. Why was his father here? What did he want? Minutes passed. Agonizing, slow minutes, before there was a knock on his door. "Jacob," Claire's voice was gentle. "Can I come in?" He hesitated, then opened the door. Her expression was kind but serious. "Your father's here," she said softly. "He wants to talk to you." "No," Jacob said immediately, his voice trembling. "I don't want to see him." Claire knelt in front of him, her eyes searching his. "I understand," she said, "but he says he's looking for a chance to make things right." Jacob shook his head, anger and fear bubbling up inside him. He had years to make things right. He doesn't care. He never cared. Claire reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to talk to him if you don't want to," she assured him. "This is your choice." Jacob stayed in his room for hours, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He thought of the life he had built with Matthew and Claire, the warmth they had given him. But a small, stubborn part of him, the part that remembered his father's rare smiles and kind words, wondered if maybe, just maybe, people could change. Finally, as the sky darkened, he opened his door. Claire was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, and when she saw him, she nodded encouragingly. Jacob stepped into the living room, his heart pounding. His father stood by the window, staring out into the snowy night. When he turned to face Jacob, his expression was a mix of guilt and hope. "Hi, Jacob," he said, his voice softer than Jacob remembered. "You've grown so much." Jacob crossed his arms, keeping his distance. "Why are you here?" The man exhaled, his shoulders slumping. I made a lot of mistakes," he began. "Leaving you and your mom was the worst one. I've spent years trying to fix myself, to be better. And when I heard you were out here on your own, I had to come." Jacob stared at him, his emotions swirling. "You left us," he said, his voice cracking. "Mom needed you, and you just left." "I know," his father said, his voice heavy with regret. "And I'll never be able to make up for that. But I'm here now, and I want to help. If you'll let me." The room fell silent, the tension almost unbearable. Jacob didn't know what to say. He wanted to scream, to cry, to believe his father's words and reject them all at once. "I don't know if I can trust you," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. His father nodded. "That's fair," he said. "But I'm not going anywhere this time. You can take all the time you need." That night, Jacob sat by the Christmas tree, his journal open in his lap. He stared at the blank page, his mind racing. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, second chances could be real. The tree lights twinkled, casting soft shadows across the room. As the clock struck midnight, the weight in Jacob's chest began to lift, if only slightly. For now it was enough. Christmas morning dawned quietly. Snow blanketed the streets outside, muffling the world in a serene white stillness. Jacob sat by the window in his room, watching the flakes drift lazily from the sky. His father's arrival the night before had left him restless. Sleep had been elusive, his thoughts a tangled web of anger, confusion, and a cautious, fragile hope. Downstairs, the smell of fresh-baked cinnamon rolls wafted through the house. Claire's laughter mingled with Matthew's deeper chuckle, a soft reminder of the warmth that surrounded Jacob. For a brief moment, he considered staying in his room, avoiding the world altogether. But the sound of voices, one of them his father's, drew him out. When Jacob entered the living room, Matthew was setting a stack of plates on the dining table, while Claire poured hot coffee into mugs. His father stood awkwardly by the Christmas tree, his hands in his coat pockets. The sight of him made Jacob's stomach twist, but he kept walking. "Good morning," Matthew said, his smile as easy as ever. "You hungry?" Claire made enough cinnamon rolls to feed the whole neighborhood. Jacob nodded, muttering a quiet, "Morning." The meal was quiet at first. Matthew and Claire kept the conversation light, chatting about the snowfall and their plans for the day. Jacob kept his head down, eating in silence. His father occasionally glanced at him, but he didn't push for conversation. Finally, after the plates were cleared, Jacob stood. "Can we talk?" he asked, looking directly at his father. The man straightened, his expression a mix of surprise and relief. "Of course," he said, his voice steady. They moved to the porch, where the cold air nipped at their faces. Jacob shoved his hands into his pockets, staring out at the snow-covered street. For a long time, neither of them spoke. "Why now?" Jacob finally asked, his voice tight. "Why show up after all this time?" His father exhaled, his breath forming a small cloud in the icy air. "Because I was scared," he admitted. "I knew I'd messed up, and I didn't know how to fix it. I thought staying away was better for you and your mom." Jacob turned to face him, his eyes blazing. "It wasn't. She needed you and I needed you, and you just left." "I know," his father said, his voice breaking. "I know I failed you. I've lived with that every day since. And I'm not asking you to forgive me, Jacob. I just want a chance to be here now, to try and make things right." The raw honesty in his father's voice caught Jacob off guard. He wanted to lash out, to cling to his anger, but the vulnerability in front of him made it hard. He looked away, his breath hitching. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Jacob said, his voice cracking. But I guess you can try." His father nodded, his eyes glistening. "That's all I ask." When they returned inside, the warmth of the house was a stark contrast to the cold outside. Matthew and Claire were in the kitchen, packing leftover cinnamon rolls into a tin. They glanced up as Jacob and his father entered, and Claire offered Jacob a soft smile, as if to say, "You're doing great." The rest of the day passed in a quiet, peaceful blur. They decorated gingerbread cookies and played board games by the fire. For the first time in years, Jacob felt the weight of Christmas not as a reminder of loss, but as a day filled with connection and possibility. That evening, as the snow fell steadily outside, Jacob sat by the tree, his journal in hand. He flipped to a new page and began to write. "Today I gave him a chance. I don't know what comes next, but maybe that's okay." For the first time, the thought of an uncertain future didn't terrify him. Instead, it felt like a door, a small, hesitant opening to something new. The days following Christmas were a cautious dance between past wounds and tentative beginnings. Jacob's father, James, didn't push too hard, respecting the unspoken boundaries that still hung between them. He stayed at a nearby motel, returning each day to spend time with Jacob, Matthew, and Claire. At first, Jacob avoided being alone with him. He preferred the comfortable, steady presence of Matthew or Claire nearby. But as the days passed, he began to notice small things about James. The way he carefully listened when Jacob spoke. His nervous habits of tapping his fingers against his thigh or tugging at his coat when he wasn't sure of himself. One afternoon, while Matthew was out running errands and Claire worked in the kitchen, James found Jacob in the backyard. The snowman they had built days ago was now slumping, its carrot nose dangling precariously. "Mind if I sit?" James asked, motioning to the patio bench where Jacob was perched. Jacob shrugged but didn't say no. James took the invitation, sitting quietly for a moment before speaking. "You know, when you were little, you loved building snowmen," James said, a faint smile crossing his face. "We'd spend hours outside, and your mom would have to drag us in before we froze." Jacob didn't look at him, his eyes focused on the snow-covered yard. "I don't remember that," he said flatly. James nodded, his expression tinged with regret. "I don't blame you. It was a long time ago." The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. For the first time, Jacob felt like James wasn't trying to force something. He was just there. Later that evening, after dinner, Jacob lingered in the living room while Matthew and Claire cleaned up in the kitchen. James sat on the couch, leafing through a photo album Claire had brought out earlier. "This was you, right?" James asked, holding up a picture of a small boy with a mischievous grin, bundled in an oversized scarf. Jacob couldn't help but smile faintly. "Yeah," he said, stepping closer. "Mom loved that scarf. She made me wear it even when it wasn't cold." James chuckled, the sound light but genuine. "She always knew best, didn't she?" Jacob nodded, his smile fading as he looked at the picture. "She really missed you, you know," he said quietly. "Even when she tried to hide it, I could tell." James set the album down, his face serious. "I missed her too, Jacob, and I missed you. I didn't know how to come back." As the days turned into weeks, the tension between them began to ease. James started to show up with small gestures. A book he thought Jacob might like, hot chocolate from the cafe down the street. They weren't grand gestures, but they were enough to show that he was trying. One snowy afternoon, James showed up with a sled. "There's a hill just a few blocks away," he said, his tone almost shy. "What do you say?" Jacob hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." The hill was alive with the sound of children laughing, their colorful scarves and jackets bright against the white snow. Jacob and James took turns on the sled, tumbling into the powdery drifts more times than they could count. For the first time in years, Jacob laughed. A real, unguarded laugh that echoed through the crisp winter air. As they trudged home, cheeks red from the cold, James glanced at Jacob. "Thanks for today," he said. "It meant a lot to me." Jacob didn't reply, but the small smile on his face said enough. That night, as Jacob lay in bed, he picked up his journal. "I think he's trying. And maybe I'm starting to believe him. Jacob closed the journal and stared at the ceiling, the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through his window. For the first time, he felt like the pieces of his life, broken and scattered for so long, might slowly be finding their way back together. The weeks after Christmas passed like a soft snowfall, slow and quiet, yet steady. Jacob began to find a tentative rhythm with James. They spoke more often, though always on neutral ground. Memories of snowmen, books Jacob was reading, or the strange habits of the neighbor's cat that liked to wander into the yard. But the past still lingered, a shadow neither of them could quite face directly. Claire noticed the progress and encouraged it gently. Healing isn't a straight path, she told Jacob one evening as they washed dishes together. It's okay to feel unsure. Just take it one step at a time. One day, as Jacob rummaged through a box of Matthew's old tools in the garage, James appeared in the doorway. "Need help?" he asked, his voice light but cautious. Jacob hesitated, then shrugged. "I guess." They worked in silence for a while, Jacob untangling wires while James sorted screws into small compartments. It wasn't until they were almost finished that James spoke again. "Your mom. She used to fix everything around the house," he said, his voice low. "I wasn't much good with tools, but she could repair just about anything." Jacob glanced at him. "I remember that," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "She fixed my bike when I bent the wheel." James chuckled softly. She wasn't just fixing things. She was holding everything together. The weight of his words settled between them. Jacob wanted to say something, to ask the questions that had burned in his chest for years. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he nodded and went back to the wires. A week later, while Matthew and Claire were out for the evening, James arrived with a small box under his arm. "Thought we could watch something," he said, holding up an old DVD of the Goonies. Jacob's eyes lit up. "I used to love that movie," he said before he could stop himself. "I know," James said with a small smile. "You made me watch it 100 times. They settled onto the couch, a bowl of popcorn between them. As the movie played, Jacob found himself laughing, not just at the jokes but at James's commentary. His dry remarks about the pirate ship and his exaggerated impressions of the characters. For a little while, it felt almost normal. But healing wasn't a straight path, as Claire had said. The closer James and Jacob grew, the more the old pain rose to the surface. One evening, after James left, Jacob retreated to his room and opened his journal. The words poured out before he could stop them. "He left us. He left her. I don't know if I can ever forgive him for that." When Jacob looked at the page, the anger he felt was undeniable. But beneath it was something else. A small, fragile hope that maybe, one day, forgiveness would come. One icy morning, Matthew and Claire suggested a hike through a nearby trail, one that ended at a frozen lake. Jacob agreed reluctantly, bundling up in layers of sweaters and scarves. To his surprise, James showed up, ready to join them. The hike was challenging, the ground slippery and uneven, but the lake was worth it. It stretched out like a silver mirror, the trees reflected perfectly on its surface. Jacob stood at the edge, his breath visible in the cold air. "This is amazing," he said, turning to James. "Mom would have loved this." James nodded, his expression soft. "She would have," he said. "She always found beauty in everything." For the first time, Jacob didn't feel the need to pull away. He let the moment linger, the silence between them filled with unspoken promises. That night, as Jacob wrote in his journal, he paused before setting his pen to paper. Slowly, he wrote, "I don't know if I can forgive him yet, but I think I want to try." The words felt heavy and light all at once, like the first step across a fragile bridge. A week after the hike, Jacob's cautious peace was shattered by an unexpected visit. James had stayed consistent in his efforts, showing up each day with quiet patience. But this time, someone else arrived alongside him. A woman Jacob didn't recognize. She had sharp features, her coat immaculate, and an expression that made the room feel smaller. "This is Karen," James said, his tone careful. She's my partner." Jacob stiffened immediately. "You brought her here?" The question came out sharper than he intended. "I thought it was time you met," James replied, his voice faltering under the weight of Jacob's glare. Karen stepped forward, her hand extended. "It's nice to finally meet you, Jacob." But Jacob didn't move. Instead, he turned and walked out the back door, the sound of it slamming echoing behind him. Matthew found him sitting on the porch steps, his breath coming in angry clouds. "Hey, kid," he said gently, taking a seat beside him. Jacob didn't look at him. "He just shows up with her like that, like it's no big deal. He doesn't get it." "No," Matthew agreed. "He doesn't. But maybe he's trying to." Jacob clenched his fists. "I was starting to trust him. Now it's like he's replacing everything. Mom, me, all of it." Matthew let the silence sit for a moment before he spoke. "Do you think that's what he wants?" Jacob hesitated, his anger flickering with doubt. "I don't know," he admitted. "But it feels that way." Matthew put a hand on Jacob's shoulder. "You've been through more than most people ever should. But trust isn't about pretending things are perfect. It's about figuring out if you want to build something, even when it's messy." That night, Jacob sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames. When James approached, he didn't look up. "I'm sorry," James said quietly, sitting across from him. "I should have asked before bringing Karen. That wasn't fair to you." Jacob didn't respond right away. He felt the knot of anger in his chest loosening, but it wasn't gone. "Why did you leave us?" he asked suddenly, his voice trembling. "I've been trying to figure it out, but I don't get it. Why didn't you stay?" James leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression heavy with regret. "I was scared," he said. "Your mom was strong, so much stronger than I ever was. I felt like I wasn't good enough for her or for you. So instead of fighting to be better, I ran." Jacob's throat tightened. "She didn't deserve that. I didn't deserve that." "No," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't. And I'll regret it for the rest of my life." The weight of James's words hung in the air, raw and undeniable. Jacob didn't know if he could forgive him. Not yet. But something in his father's voice made him want to try. As the days passed, James stayed consistent, careful not to push too hard. Karen didn't return, and Jacob noticed James giving him more space, letting him dictate the pace of their growing relationship. For the first time, Jacob felt like he had some control, like his feelings mattered. One afternoon, as they sat in the living room playing chess, Jacob spoke without looking up. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet." James nodded, his expression somber. "That's okay. I'm not going anywhere." The simplicity of the statement caught Jacob off guard. He glanced at his father, searching his face for any sign of insincerity, but found none. "I guess we can keep trying," Jacob said, his voice quiet but firm. James smiled faintly. "I'd like that." That evening, Jacob wrote in his journal again. "I think I'm ready to see what happens next. Maybe it won't be perfect, but maybe that's okay." For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like something worth exploring. The winter began to thaw, the heavy snows giving way to soft, muddy ground and the first signs of green poking through the frost. Jacob found himself spending more time outside, his energy lighter, his steps less burdened. James continued to visit, always careful not to overstay or overwhelm. He brought small, thoughtful gestures. A thermos of soup on a cold day, a new journal when Jacob's old one began to fill up. They talked more often, though not always about the past. Sometimes it was about books or the stars or even nothing at all. One quiet evening, as Jacob helped Claire clean up after dinner, she paused, leaning against the counter with a knowing smile. "You're doing well, Jacob," she said. "I can see it in you." He shrugged, rinsing a plate. "I guess it's different. That's what growth feels like," she said. "Messy, uncomfortable, but worth it." Jacob nodded. "I'm still mad sometimes. At him. At everything." "That's okay," Claire replied. "Healing isn't about erasing what happened. It's about learning to carry it differently." The next weekend, James invited Jacob to visit a community center where he volunteered. "They've got a great library," he said. "Thought you might like it." Jacob agreed, more out of curiosity than excitement. When they arrived, He was surprised to see James greeted warmly by the staff and kids. He watched as his father worked with a group of younger boys, helping them build model planes. The ease and kindness in James's actions caught Jacob off guard. "Is this what you've been doing?" Jacob asked later, as they sat on the steps outside the center. James nodded. "It's part of what helped me get my life back together, being around people who needed someone to show up for them. It reminded me of what I'd lost and what I still had to give." Jacob was quiet, turning the words over in his mind. For the first time, he saw James not just as the man who had left, but as someone truly trying to be better. Spring arrived with the promise of new beginnings. The neighborhood buzzed with life. Kids on bikes, dogs barking, flowers blooming in front yards. Matthew and Claire encouraged Jacob to make plans for the summer, suggesting activities he might enjoy. For the first time, he considered the possibility of a future, one with stability, with joy. On a warm Saturday, James invited Jacob to plant a tree in the backyard. "Something to grow alongside us," James said with a small smile. Jacob smirked. "That's cheesy." "Maybe," James replied, "but it's worth a shot." They worked together, digging into the soft earth, their hands dirty and their laughter easy. When the tree was finally planted, they stood side by side, looking at the small sapling swaying gently in the breeze. "It's a start," Jacob said quietly. James glanced at him, his expression soft. "It is." That night, Jacob sat at his desk, staring at his journal. He flipped through the filled pages, the entries a record of his journey. Anger, doubt, tentative hope. He reached the last page and wrote carefully, "I'm not sure what the future holds, but for the first time I think I'm okay with that. We're growing, all of us, and maybe that's enough." Closing the journal, Jacob set it aside and climbed into bed. As he drifted off to sleep, the weight on his chest felt lighter, replaced by the steady rhythm of possibility. Jacob's story wasn't one of perfect endings or sweeping resolutions, but it was real, a story of growth, of small steps and hard conversations, of learning to let go and hold on at the same time. And in the quiet, messy beauty of it all, Jacob discovered something he thought he'd lost forever: the courage to believe in tomorrow. Boy finds a lost child at the train station and decides to help her get home. When he arrives at the indicated location, he discovers something that no one expected. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the bustling train station. People hurried past, each consumed by their plans, their worries, or their screens. Amid the chaos, 19-year-old Daniel, returning from a weekend visit to his grandparents, noticed a little girl sitting on a bench, clutching a worn teddy bear. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Her large, tear-filled eyes darted around anxiously. "Hey there," Daniel crouched to her eye level. "Are you lost?" She nodded, her curly brown hair bobbing as she sniffled. I don't know where Mommy is." She said to wait, but she didn't come back. Daniel's heart clenched. He glanced around, but no one seemed to pay attention. "Okay, don't worry. My name's Daniel. What's yours?" "Lila. Nice to meet you, Lila. Let's find someone who can help." He held out his hand, and after a hesitant moment, she took it. Daniel led her toward the station's information desk, hoping to locate her parents. The elderly attendant at the counter shook her head regretfully after scanning her system. "No one's reported a lost child today," she said, her brow furrowed. "You could try the police station down the street." "Thank you," Daniel said, squeezing Lila's hand gently. Outside, the cool evening breeze ruffled their hair. Daniel tried to keep Lila calm as they walked toward the station. "Do you remember your address, Lila?" he asked. "Uh-huh," she said softly, her fingers tracing the teddy bear's frayed seams. "It's a big white house with red flowers." Daniel paused. "Do you know the street name?" It's Rose something." After some coaxing, she mentioned enough details for Daniel to pull up a location that matched the description on his phone. It was a suburban neighborhood about a 15-minute ride away. They caught a bus, Lila sitting close to Daniel. Her tiny hand clung to his jacket as the vehicle bumped along the road. When they reached the address, the atmosphere seemed off. The house stood at the edge of a quiet street, pristine with white paneling and neatly trimmed bushes. But the driveway was empty, and no lights shone from within. "Is this it?" Daniel asked. Lila nodded vigorously. "Yes, that's my home." He guided her up the steps and knocked on the door. The echo that followed was unsettling. No footsteps approached, no voices responded. Daniel's unease grew. He tried the doorbell. Still nothing. "Do you have a key?" he asked her. "No," Lila murmured, her expression falling. "Mommy always has it." A flicker of movement caught Daniel's attention. Across the street, a neighbor peered out from their window before quickly shutting their curtains. Something wasn't right. "Let's check around the back," Daniel suggested. As they rounded the house, Lila let out a gasp. "Mommy's flowers," she cried, pointing to the withered garden. The once vivid red blooms lay brown and brittle. Before Daniel could respond, the kitchen door creaked open on rusty hinges. The house wasn't empty after all. The open kitchen door swung slightly in the breeze, creaking softly on its hinges. Daniel instinctively placed a protective hand on Lila's shoulder. "Stay close, okay?" he whispered. Lila clung to his side as they stepped cautiously inside. The house was eerily quiet, filled only with the faint ticking of a clock somewhere deeper within. The air smelled stale, like it had been closed up for days. "Hello," Daniel called, his voice echoing in the stillness. No answer. The kitchen was tidy but cold, its countertops clear except for a single empty coffee mug. Daniel noticed unopened mail stacked neatly by the sink. One envelope, marked with bold red lettering, caught his eye. "Final notice." "This doesn't feel right," Daniel muttered under his breath. "Lila, are you sure this is your house?" "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "That's where Mommy makes breakfast." She pointed to the stove. Daniel frowned. The appliances looked untouched, as though no one had cooked there in days. He tried to mask his growing unease with a reassuring smile. "Let's check upstairs," he said, keeping his tone light. The staircase creaked with each step, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence. Lila seemed to grow quieter with every passing second, her usual chatter replaced by worried glances. At the top of the stairs, Daniel paused. The hallway was dim, with only a faint light coming from one of the rooms. "Wait here," he told Lila, but she shook her head furiously. "I'm scared," she whispered, clutching his arm. Daniel sighed, nodding for her to follow as they approached the lit room. Inside, a lamp on the nightstand cast a soft glow over what looked like the master bedroom. The bed was unmade, a faint imprint still visible on the pillow. On the nightstand lay a silver bracelet with a charm that spelled Lila. Beside it was a photograph of a woman holding Lila in her arms, both smiling at the camera. Daniel recognized her immediately. "That's Mommy," Lila exclaimed, running to the picture. But her excitement faded when she noticed the empty chair in the corner of the room, as though someone had been sitting there moments ago. Daniel scanned the space. "Where could she be?" he murmured to himself. "Why would she leave the door open?" Before he could investigate further, a loud thud echoed from downstairs. Daniel froze, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Lila gasped and instinctively wrapped her arms around his waist. "It's okay," Daniel said, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to reassure. "Stay behind me." They crept downstairs, the thudding sound repeating intermittently, like something heavy being dragged. It was coming from the living room. The once bright space was dim in the fading daylight, shadows pooling in the corners. "Hello," Daniel called again, trying to sound confident. Still no response. The noise stopped abruptly. Daniel squinted toward the far end of the room, where a tall grandfather clock stood against the wall. Beside it was an antique cabinet with one door slightly ajar. He approached cautiously and pulled the door open. Inside was a box of children's toys, blocks, books, and a small doll dressed in a yellow dress. Lila's eyes lit up. "That's mine," she exclaimed, reaching for the doll. But Daniel noticed something else tucked behind the toys. A manila folder, its edges worn and smudged. He pulled it out and opened it. Inside were several papers, the top one bearing the bold heading, custody hearing. Daniel's breath caught. "What is this?" he muttered. The document listed Lila's name alongside her mother's. But there was another name, too, someone Daniel didn't recognize, marked as the opposing party. He barely had time to process the information when another sound startled him. A voice, faint but distinct, coming from the front yard. "Lila!" Lila perked up. "Mommy!" she cried, running toward the front door before Daniel could stop her. The front yard was bathed in the orange glow of sunset. A woman stood near the gate, her disheveled hair falling over her face as she waved frantically. Daniel recognized her immediately from the photo upstairs. It was Lila's mother. But there was something wild in her eyes, something that made Daniel hesitate. "Lila, come to me," she called, her voice cracking with desperation. Lila darted down the steps, her teddy bear bouncing in her grip. "Mommy!" Daniel followed, uneasy. As he stepped outside, he noticed a car parked haphazardly across the street, its engine still running. The woman scooped Lila into her arms, holding her tightly. "Thank God," she whispered, before looking up at Daniel. Her expression was a mix of gratitude and something darker. You brought her home?" "Yeah," Daniel said cautiously. "She was at the train station." She seemed lost. The woman's grip on Lila tightened. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't mean to leave her alone. It wasn't supposed to." She stopped abruptly, her gaze flicking toward the house. Daniel followed her eyes and noticed something strange. The curtain in the master bedroom fluttering slightly, as though someone was watching them. The woman's eyes remained locked on the fluttering curtain, her face paling. Daniel stepped closer, trying to read her expression. She held Lila protectively, her hand trembling slightly. Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice low. She blinked, snapping out of her daze. "Yes," she said quickly, though the tension in her voice suggested otherwise. "Thank you for bringing her back. I don't know what I'd have done if..." Her voice trailed off, and she forced a weak smile at Lila. "Let's go inside, sweetheart." Lila nodded eagerly, her earlier anxiety gone now that she was reunited with her mother. But as the woman turned toward the house, Daniel's unease deepened. "Wait," he said. "Something feels off." The woman stiffened but didn't turn around. "You've done enough, young man. I appreciate your help, but this is family business now." "Family business?" Daniel's curiosity flared. He glanced up at the house again, half expecting to see someone peering out from behind the curtain. But the window was still. "If you need help, maybe we should call someone," Daniel said, stepping closer. There was a custody paper inside. The woman spun around, her face a mix of fear and frustration. "You shouldn't have gone through my things," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to make Lila flinch. She immediately softened, running a hand over her daughter's curls. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to yell. It's just complicated." Daniel took a step back, unsure how to respond. He could see the stress etched into her features, but there was something else, something she wasn't saying. Before he could press further, the faint sound of a door creaking open caught their attention. All three of them turned toward the house. The front door, which had been firmly closed a moment ago, now hung slightly ajar. "Mommy?" Lila whispered, her voice trembling again. The woman hugged her daughter close. "Stay here," she said firmly, setting Lila on the ground beside Daniel. Her eyes darted between the door and the shadows lengthening across the yard. "Both of you..." "No," Daniel said, stepping forward. "You shouldn't go in there alone." She hesitated, glancing at him, and then nodded reluctantly. Together, they approached the house, leaving Lila safely near the gate. Inside, the silence was oppressive. The air seemed heavier now, the stillness more pronounced. The woman hesitated at the threshold, her hand hovering near the doorknob. "Is anyone here?" Daniel called, his voice echoing faintly. The only reply was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room. The woman stepped in cautiously, her bare feet making no sound on the polished floor. Daniel followed, his shoes creaking faintly. "Who else has a key to the house?" Daniel asked, his voice low. "No one," she said without looking back. Not anymore. Not anymore? She didn't answer. Instead, she moved toward the stairs, glancing nervously upward. Stay close. Daniel hesitated but followed. As they reached the top, a faint noise came from the master bedroom. The sound of something shifting, almost imperceptibly. Daniel felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. The woman pushed open the bedroom door, and both of them froze. The lamp on the nightstand was off, though it had been on earlier. The silver bracelet was gone, leaving the nightstand bare. What? Daniel began, but the woman motioned for him to be quiet. She stepped toward the closet, her movements slow and deliberate. Reaching out, she grabbed the handle and yanked it open. Nothing. Only neatly hung clothes and a few storage boxes. It's not safe here, she whispered, more to herself than to Daniel. I should have known. What are you talking about? Daniel demanded. She turned to him, her eyes filled with desperation. You need to leave. Now, take Lila and go. What? No, I'm not leaving you here. Please. Her voice broke, and for the first time, Daniel saw tears welling in her eyes. This isn't your fight. You've done enough. The sound of shattering glass interrupted her. Both of them spun toward the noise, which had come from downstairs. Daniel's pulse quickened as a heavy thud followed, like something or someone was moving through the house. Mommy! Lila's voice came from outside, high-pitched and terrified. Without thinking, Daniel bolted for the stairs, taking them two at a time. Lila! He shouted, his mind racing. He burst outside to find Lila standing frozen near the gate, her wide eyes fixed on the car parked across the street. The driver's side door was open now, though no one was inside. Daniel ran to her, pulling her into his arms. What happened? Are you okay? She pointed toward the car. I saw someone. They got out and ran that way. Daniel turned in the direction she indicated, but whoever it was had already disappeared into the growing shadows. The woman emerged from the house moments later, her face pale. We're leaving, she said firmly, striding toward them. Now? Daniel didn't argue. He scooped Lila into his arms and followed the woman to the car. As they climbed in, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching them. As the engine roared to life and they sped away, Daniel glanced back at the house. The curtain in the master bedroom fluttered again, this time with undeniable intent. Someone was still there. The car sped through the quiet streets, its headlights slicing through the growing darkness. Lila sat in the back seat, clinging tightly to her teddy bear, her wide eyes fixed on the rear window as though expecting to see someone chasing them. Daniel sat in the passenger seat, his mind racing with unanswered questions. The woman, Lila's mother, gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles white. Her face was a mask of determination, but her trembling hands betrayed her fear. Where are we going? Daniel finally asked, breaking the tense silence. Somewhere safe, she replied curtly, her eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. That doesn't tell me much, Daniel said, his frustration mounting. What's going on? Who was in the house? She didn't answer immediately, her jaw tightening. It doesn't matter. All that matters is getting Lila out of danger. Daniel turned in his seat to look at the little girl. Do you know who that was, Lila? Lila shook her head, her curls bouncing. No, she whispered. Mommy, is it the bad man? The woman's hands twitched on the wheel. No, sweetheart, she said, her voice forcedly calm. Everything's okay now. Who's the bad man? Daniel pressed. She shot him a sharp glance. Stop asking questions. You don't understand. You're right. I don't. Daniel cut in. But I found your daughter, and now I'm here in the middle of this. I think I deserve an explanation. The car skidded slightly as she pulled over abruptly to the side of the road. She turned to face Daniel, her expression a mix of anger and desperation. Look, I don't have time to explain everything. All you need to know is that Lila's father, my ex, has been trying to take her away from me. He's dangerous. Daniel's stomach sank. Dangerous how? Let's just say he's not the kind of person you want raising a child, she said, her voice heavy. I've been fighting for custody, but he doesn't care about the law. He wants her back, and he'll do whatever it takes. Daniel stared at her, trying to process the revelation. So that's why the house, yes, she said, cutting him off. I thought we were safe there. But clearly, I was wrong. The tension in the car was palpable as they merged back onto the road. Daniel wanted to press for more details, but one look at Lila's frightened face silenced him. The city lights gradually faded as they drove into the outskirts. Rolling hills and darkened fields stretched out on either side of the road. The silence was heavy, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional sniffle from Lila. "Where are we going now?" Daniel asked after a long pause. "A motel," the woman replied. "Just for the night. I need to figure out what to do next." "Do you even have a plan?" Daniel's tone was sharper than he intended. She didn't respond, her focus on the dark road ahead. Daniel leaned back in his seat, exhaling deeply. This night was turning into something far beyond what he'd expected. They pulled into a small, nondescript motel just off the highway. The flickering neon sign cast a dim red glow over the parking lot. The woman parked the car and turned to Lila. "Stay here with Daniel, okay? I'll go check us in." Lila nodded solemnly, clutching her teddy bear like a lifeline. Daniel watched as her mother disappeared into the motel office, her silhouette briefly illuminated by the harsh fluorescent light inside. "Are you scared?" Daniel asked Lila softly. She nodded again. "A little." Daniel offered her a reassuring smile. "It's okay. I won't let anything happen to you." Lila looked up at him, her small face serious. "You're nice. Like a big brother." The words warmed Daniel's heart, but before he could respond, a noise caught his attention. A faint rustling coming from the bushes at the edge of the parking lot. His head snapped toward the sound. "Stay here," he told Lila firmly, stepping out of the car. The cool night air prickled his skin as he approached the bushes, his pulse quickening. "Hello," he called, his voice steady despite his nerves. There was no reply, only the sound of leaves shifting. Daniel's hand tightened into a fist, though he wasn't sure what he'd do if someone, or something, appeared. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the woman, returning from the office with a room key in hand. "What are you doing out here?" she asked, her voice sharp with worry. Daniel relaxed slightly, though his unease lingered. "I thought I heard something." She scanned the parking lot, her eyes narrowing. "Get Lila inside. Now." The motel room was small but clean, with 2 beds and a small table by the window. Lila climbed onto one of the beds, curling up with her teddy bear. Her mother closed the curtains tightly, then locked and bolted the door. Daniel sat on the edge of the second bed, watching her. "You think someone's following us?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice weary. "But we can't take any chances." Lila's breathing grew steady as she drifted off to sleep, her tiny form looking even smaller against the large bed. The woman sank into a chair by the window, her shoulders slumping as the adrenaline began to wear off. "Thank you," she said softly, not looking at Daniel. "For helping us." Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "What's your name?" She glanced at him, as though debating whether to answer. Finally, she said, "Claire." "Well, Claire," Daniel said, leaning forward, "we can't just keep running. There has to be a way to stop him." Claire's expression hardened. "You don't know him. You don't know what he's capable of." "Then tell me," Daniel pressed. "If I'm going to help you, I need to know what we're up against." Claire opened her mouth to respond but stopped abruptly, her head snapping toward the window. Daniel followed her gaze, his stomach nodding. A shadow moved outside, just beyond the curtain. Daniel and Claire locked eyes, the air in the room suddenly thick with tension. Outside, the shadow moved again, slow and deliberate. It lingered just beyond the flimsy motel curtain, its shape distorted by the dim light from the parking lot. Claire sprang to her feet, her breathing shallow. "Stay with Lila," she whispered sharply, inching toward the window. "No way," Daniel said, rising. "We're doing this together." Claire shot him a look but didn't argue. She reached for the lamp on the table and switched it off, plunging the room into darkness. They stood motionless, listening intently. Lila stirred slightly in her sleep, but thankfully, she didn't wake. The sound of footsteps crunching on gravel reached their ears. Slow, purposeful. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to hide. Claire held her breath and pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. Her hand flew to her mouth. Daniel leaned over her shoulder, his pulse racing. A man stood by the car they'd arrived in, his figure silhouetted against the dim motel lights. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, staring directly at their room. "That's him," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "That's Lila's father." Daniel's chest tightened. The man was tall, with broad shoulders and a posture that exuded both confidence and menace. Even from this distance, there was something unsettling about him. He wasn't shouting or trying to force his way in, just standing there, as if daring them to make the first move. "We have to call the police," Daniel whispered. Claire shook her head vehemently. "He'll be gone by the time they arrive. That's what he does. Shows up to scare me, then disappears." "This isn't normal," Daniel said, his voice low but firm. "You can't just let him intimidate you." Claire turned to him, her eyes flashing with a mix of anger and desperation. "You think I haven't tried? Restraining orders, police reports, they don't matter to someone like him. He knows how to stay just on the right side of the law." Daniel opened his mouth to argue but stopped when the man took a step closer to the room. His heart pounded in his chest as the man bent down and placed something on the hood of the car. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. "What did he leave?" Daniel asked, his voice tight. "I don't know," Claire said. "Stay here. I'll check." "No, you won't," Daniel said firmly. "I'll go." Claire hesitated, but the determination in Daniel's voice silenced her protest. He grabbed his jacket and slipped quietly out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. The night air was cool, the gravel crunching under his sneakers as he approached the car. His eyes darted around, scanning the parking lot for any sign of movement. It was eerily quiet. On the hood of the car was a small envelope, the edges weighted down with a rock. Daniel glanced around one more time before grabbing it and hurrying back to the room. Inside, Claire snatched the envelope from his hand, her fingers trembling as she tore it open. Daniel watched as her face turned pale. "What does it say?" he asked. Claire didn't answer immediately. Instead, she handed him the note, her eyes wide with fear. Daniel took it, the neat handwriting sending a chill down his spine. "You can't run forever, Claire. Bring her back where she belongs, or I'll come and get her myself." The words were simple, but the threat was unmistakable. Daniel looked up at Claire, his jaw tightening. "We need to get out of here. Now." "No," Claire said, shaking her head. "If we keep running, he'll just keep chasing us. We need to end this." "And how do you propose we do that?" Daniel demanded. "You said it yourself. He doesn't play by the rules." Claire's gaze hardened. "There's one person who might be able to help." The next hour passed in a blur. Claire packed their belongings quickly, her movements efficient but frantic. Daniel woke Lila, who groggily asked where they were going but didn't protest. They piled back into the car and pulled out of the motel parking lot, the taillights fading into the darkness. "Who are we going to see?" Daniel asked as they drove down the highway. "A lawyer," Claire said. "He helped me with the custody case before, but I stopped working with him when I thought I could handle things on my own. I was wrong." Daniel glanced at Lila in the back seat. She had fallen asleep again, her teddy bear clutched tightly to her chest. "What makes you think he can stop your ex?" Claire hesitated. "Because he knows things that can ruin him." As they approached the city limits, the oppressive silence in the car was broken by the sound of Claire's phone buzzing. She glanced at the screen and went pale. "It's him," she whispered. Daniel tensed. "Don't answer it." But Claire shook her head. "If I don't, he'll just escalate." With trembling fingers, she pressed the call button and put the phone on speaker. "Claire," the voice on the other end drawled, cold and calculated. "Running again, are we? You should know by now it won't work. What do you want?" Claire's voice was steady, but Daniel could see the strain in her expression. "You know what I want," the man said. Lila belongs with me. She's not a possession, Claire snapped. She's my daughter, and I'm not letting you hurt her. A low chuckle echoed through the line. Hurt her? No, Claire. The only one who'll get hurt is you if you keep defying me. Daniel's hand clenched into a fist, his anger bubbling to the surface. He leaned closer to the phone. Stay away from her. There was a pause, and then the man laughed. Ah, the good Samaritan. Don't get involved in things you don't understand, boy. This is between me and Claire. The call ended abruptly, leaving the car in heavy silence. Daniel exhaled slowly, his fists unclenching. He's not going to stop. No, Claire said, her voice firm. But neither will I. The city lights loomed ahead, their glow promising both danger and the faintest glimmer of hope. The car hummed quietly as they approached the heart of the city. Claire gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, while Daniel sat tensely beside her, his gaze flicking between the rearview mirror and the sleeping form of Lila in the back seat. We're almost there, Claire said, breaking the silence. Daniel glanced at her. This lawyer? Can you really trust him? Claire hesitated. I don't have much of a choice. He's the only one who knows the full story, and he's not afraid of my ek. Daniel wasn't entirely reassured, but he kept his concerns to himself. The streets became narrower as they entered an older part of the city, where the buildings leaned close together and the streetlights cast long, eerie shadows. Claire turned down a quiet alley and parked in front of a modest office building. The sign above the door read, Gerald Finch, Family Law Attorney. They entered the dimly lit lobby, where a tired receptionist looked up from her desk. Claire stepped forward. I need to see Gerald, she said. The receptionist frowned. It's late. He's not taking appointments. It's urgent, Claire interrupted, her tone firm. Tell him it's Claire Morgan. The receptionist hesitated, then picked up the phone and murmured a few words. A moment later, she nodded. He'll see you. Thank you, Claire said, exhaling deeply. They were led into a cluttered office where an older man with salt and pepper hair sat behind a desk piled with files. Gerald Finch looked up, adjusting his glasses as Claire entered. Claire, he said, rising to greet her. It's been a while, and I see you've brought company. This is Daniel, Claire said. He's been helping me. Gerald shook Daniel's hand briskly. Appreciate it. Now, what's going on? Claire launched into the story, her words tumbling out in a rush. She explained the train station, the encounter at the house, and the threat her ex had left on the car. Gerald listened intently, his expression growing darker with each detail. I told you before, Claire, he said when she finished. He doesn't give up easily. I know, Claire said, her voice trembling. But I don't know what else to do. He's gonna keep coming for Lila. Gerald leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. I still have the evidence we gathered during the custody trial. It's not enough to put him in prison, but it might scare him off. What evidence? Daniel asked, unable to hold back his curiosity. Gerald glanced at Claire, who nodded reluctantly. Her ex-husband has a history of violence, Gerald explained. Substantiated allegations of abuse. Unfortunately, he's also wealthy and connected, which makes him slippery. Daniel frowned. If he's dangerous, why didn't the courts rule in Claire's favor? They did, Gerald said grimly. But restraining orders don't mean much to someone who operates outside the law. The room fell silent, the weight of the situation settling heavily over them. Gerald tapped his fingers on the desk, deep in thought. There is one option, he said finally. It's risky, but it could work. Claire leaned forward. What is it? Gerald hesitated. We bait him, draw him out into the open where he can't hide behind his connections or his lawyers. If we catch him in the act of violating the restraining order, especially with Lila involved, it could be enough to put him away. Claire's eyes widened. You want me to use Lila as bait? Of course not, Gerald said quickly. She wouldn't be in any danger. We'd set up a controlled environment with police nearby. But we need him to make a move. Daniel shook his head. That's too dangerous. What if something goes wrong? I'll take every precaution, Gerald assured them. But you're right. It's not without risk. The question is, are you willing to take that chance? Claire looked at Daniel, then at Lila, who was curled up in a chair nearby, still clutching her teddy bear. Her expression softened as she knelt beside her daughter, brushing a stray curl from her face. I just want her to be safe, she said quietly. And she will be, Gerald said. But the longer we let him act unchecked, the more dangerous he becomes. It's your decision, Claire. Claire stood, her face set with determination. We'll do it. But I want to know every detail of the plan before we move forward. Of course, Gerald said, pulling out a notepad. Let's get to work. For the next hour, they outlined the plan. Gerald would contact a trusted police officer to coordinate the operation. Claire would agree to meet her ex under the pretense of a negotiation, while officers remained hidden nearby. Daniel's role would be to stay with Lila, ensuring her safety at all times. As the plan took shape, Daniel couldn't shake the nagging feeling in his gut that things could spiral out of control. Outside the office, the city was eerily quiet. As they prepared to leave, Claire paused, her eyes scanning the empty street. What is it? Daniel asked. I don't know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I just have this feeling, like he's already watching us. The drive back to the motel was tense, the quiet in the car only deepening the weight of what lay ahead. Lila, now fully awake, sensed the unease around her but said nothing, clutching her teddy bear and leaning against the window. We need to act fast, Claire said, breaking the silence. He's not going to wait long before making his next move. Daniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Do you really think Gerald's plan will work? Claire hesitated, then sighed. I don't know, but it's the best chance we have. I can't keep running like this. It's no life for Lila. When they reached the motel, Daniel stayed outside with Lila, keeping a watchful eye on their surroundings, while Claire made a series of hushed phone calls. Gerald's police contact had agreed to help, and the trap was set to spring the next evening. The plan was simple but risky. Claire would contact her ex and agree to meet at a public park under the guise of discussing custody arrangements. Gerald and 2 officers would be stationed discreetly nearby, ready to intervene the moment he crossed the line. Daniel's role was clear. Stay with Lila at a safe distance, far enough from the action to avoid danger, but close enough to get her away quickly if things went south. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Daniel asked Claire as they reviewed the details one last time. We could still try something else. Claire shook her head. There is no something else. He won't stop until he gets what he wants. I have to stop him first. The next day arrived too quickly. The group met early to review the final arrangements. Gerald, dressed in an unassuming jacket and cap, gave them a reassuring nod as he gestured toward the 2 plainclothes officers waiting nearby. They'll be ready to move the moment we give the signal, Gerald said. Claire, are you prepared? As ready as I'll ever be, Claire said, though her hands betrayed a slight tremor. Daniel crouched next to Lila, who was sitting on a park bench, obliviously arranging her teddy bear's ears. You'll stay with me, okay? He told her. We'll play in the sandbox or something while your mom talks. It's like a game. Okay, Lila said, smiling faintly, but her small hand reached out and gripped Daniel's tightly, her earlier bravado faltering. The meeting point was a clearing near the park's edge, partially enclosed by trees. It offered enough visibility for the officers to stay hidden but close enough for a quick intervention. Claire stood alone, her back straight despite the obvious tension in her shoulders. Daniel kept Lila occupied at a playground about 100 feet away. He watched Claire like a hawk, his senses on high alert. The officers were in position, their faces calm but their stances ready. Gerald lingered nearby, his phone in hand. Then, a sleek black car pulled into the lot. Claire's ex emerged, his presence as imposing as Daniel remembered from the motel. He moved toward her with calculated confidence, his movements slow and deliberate. Daniel stiffened, instinctively pulling Lila closer. Mommy! Lila called out, but Daniel quickly hushed her. We have to be quiet, okay? She's talking to someone right now. Lila nodded, though her wide eyes remained fixed on her mother. The conversation began civilly enough, though Daniel couldn't make out the words. Claire gestured occasionally, her hands moving in sharp, angry motions. Her ex, on the other hand, remained eerily calm, his expression a mask of indifference. Then his demeanor changed. He stepped closer to Claire, his voice rising enough for Daniel to catch snippets of his words. "You think you can keep her from me?" Claire didn't back down. "You'll never get her. Do you hear me? Never." Her ex's voice dropped to a menacing growl, and he reached out to grab Claire's arm. That was all the officers needed. They surged forward, badges flashing as they shouted commands. "Let go of her. Hands where we can see them." The scene erupted into chaos. Claire's ex let go of her arm but didn't raise his hands. Instead, he stepped back, his face twisted into a sneer. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You can't protect her forever." One of the officers moved to restrain him, but he spun on his heel, darting back toward his car. The second officer pursued, but the man was fast, slipping into the driver's seat and revving the engine. "Stop him!" Gerald shouted, but the car screeched out of the lot, disappearing into the street. Back at the playground, Daniel crouched low with Lila, shielding her as the commotion unfolded. He glanced up to see Claire hurrying toward them, her face pale but determined. "We need to leave," she said breathlessly, scooping Lila into her arms. "But the police," Daniel began. "They'll handle it," Claire interrupted. "But he won't give up that easily. We need to keep moving." As they piled into the car once again, Daniel couldn't shake the gnawing fear in his chest. Claire's ex had slipped through their fingers, and now he was more dangerous than ever. The tension in the car was suffocating as they sped away from the park. "What happens now?" Daniel asked. Claire didn't answer immediately. She stared at the road ahead, her jaw tight. Finally, she said, "We finish this. One way or another." The car raced down the highway, the city lights fading into the distance as they headed toward the outskirts. Lila had fallen asleep in the back seat, her tiny frame curled against her teddy bear. Claire's grip on the steering wheel was ironclad, her knuckles pale. Daniel sat silently, the weight of the failed operation at the park pressing heavily on his shoulders. The officers hadn't been able to stop Claire's ex, and now the stakes felt higher than ever. "He's not going to stop," Daniel finally said, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the engine. Claire nodded, her eyes fixed on the road. "I know. So what's the plan now?" She hesitated before answering, her voice low. "We go to the cabin." Daniel frowned. "What cabin?" "My sister's," Claire explained. "It's secluded, off the grid. We can stay there for a while and figure out our next move." "And then what?" Daniel pressed. "You can't just keep hiding forever." Claire's jaw tightened. "I'll think of something. Right now, I just need to keep Lila safe." They drove through the night, stopping briefly at a gas station to refuel and grab snacks. Daniel took the opportunity to stretch his legs, the cold night air biting at his skin as he leaned against the car. Claire joined him, her arms crossed as she stared into the darkness. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly. "For what?" "For dragging you into this," she admitted. "You didn't have to help us. But you did, and now..." Daniel shook his head. "You don't need to apologize. Lila needed help, and I wasn't gonna just walk away. Couldn't." Claire gave him a small, grateful smile, though it quickly faded. "You're a good person, Daniel. Better than most." By the time they reached the cabin, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. The small wooden structure was tucked away in a dense forest, surrounded by towering pines and a thick carpet of fallen leaves. It looked peaceful, almost too peaceful given the chaos they'd left behind. Claire parked the car and turned to Daniel. "I'll get Lila inside. Can you grab the bags?" "Sure," Daniel said, stepping out into the crisp morning air. As he unloaded their belongings, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves, but something about the stillness set him on edge. Inside, the cabin was modest but cozy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and the furniture was simple but well-worn. Claire carried Lila to a small bedroom and tucked her in, smoothing her curls gently. "She's exhausted," Claire said when she rejoined Daniel in the living room. "I think we all are." Daniel nodded, setting their bags down by the door. "We'll need to take shifts. If he finds us—" "He won't," Claire interrupted, though her tone lacked conviction. "Not here." But even as she said the words, a chill ran down Daniel's spine. The hours passed slowly. While Lila slept, Daniel and Claire took turns keeping watch by the window. The quiet of the forest felt oppressive, each creak of the cabin settling sounding unnaturally loud. As night fell, Daniel sat by the fire, his eyes scanning the shadows beyond the window. Claire joined him, a steaming mug of tea in her hands. "Do you think we're safe here?" she asked softly. Daniel hesitated. "I don't know. But if he does find us, we'll be ready." Claire nodded, though the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. The next morning, the sound of a car engine shattered the fragile peace of the cabin. Claire bolted upright from the couch, her eyes wide with panic. "He's here," she whispered. Daniel rushed to the window, his heart hammering in his chest. A black SUV was parked at the edge of the clearing, its engine idling. "He found us," Daniel said grimly. Claire grabbed Lila, who had woken up crying, and held her tightly. "What do we do?" Daniel's mind raced. "We have to draw him away from the cabin. If he gets close to Lila—" "No," Claire interrupted. "I'm not leaving her." "We don't have a choice," Daniel said firmly. "If we stay here, we're sitting ducks." They quickly devised a plan. Claire would stay in the cabin with Lila while Daniel led Claire's ex away on foot, using the dense forest to his advantage. "You don't have to do this," Claire said as Daniel prepared to leave. "Yes, I do," Daniel replied, his voice steady. "Lila deserves to be safe. And so do you." Claire's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Be careful." "I will," Daniel promised. As Daniel stepped outside, the cold air prickling his skin, he turned to see Claire watching him from the window, Lila held tightly in her arms. "Hey!" Daniel shouted, drawing the attention of the man standing near the SUV. "Looking for me?" The man's head snapped toward him, his expression darkening. He began to move toward Daniel, his strides purposeful. "Come and get me," Daniel muttered, then turned and bolted into the forest. Daniel ran deeper into the woods, the branches clawing at his jacket as he pushed through the undergrowth. Behind him, the sound of heavy footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the occasional snap of a twig. Claire's ex was following, his pursuit relentless. "Keep going," Daniel muttered to himself, glancing over his shoulder. The man's dark silhouette loomed behind him, his pace unyielding. The forest grew denser as Daniel pushed on, the thick canopy above dimming the already fading light of day. He had no clear destination. His only goal was to draw the man as far from the cabin as possible. After what felt like hours but was likely minutes, Daniel stumbled upon a narrow creek cutting through the forest. Its icy water glistened faintly in the dim light. Without hesitation, he splashed into the shallow stream, letting the water wash over his shoes as he moved upstream, hoping to obscure his trail. The footsteps behind him faltered for a moment before resuming. The man was smart. He wasn't deterred by Daniel's attempt to throw him off. Think, Daniel muttered, his breath visible in the chilly air. A fallen tree ahead provided a brief opportunity. He scrambled over it and crouched behind, forcing his breathing to slow. The forest grew eerily quiet, save for the steady approach of the footsteps. The man appeared moments later, his broad figure silhouetted against the gloom. He paused at the creek's edge, scanning the surroundings. Daniel held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The man's sharp gaze lingered on the trail of water Daniel had disturbed. "Not bad," the man muttered, his voice low and cold. "But I've been at this longer than you have, kid." He moved toward the creek, stepping into the water with purpose. Daniel's pulse quickened. He couldn't stay hidden much longer. Grabbing a fist-sized rock, he hurled it into the woods to his right. The sound of it crashing through the brush made the man whip his head in that direction. "Nice try," the man said, turning back toward the creek. Before Daniel could think of his next move, a low growl broke the silence. The man froze, his head snapping toward the sound. From the shadows emerged a pair of glowing eyes, followed by the lean, muscular body of a wolf. Daniel's breath caught. The wolf stared at the man, its hackles raised, teeth bared in a menacing snarl. The man stepped back, his bravado faltering for the first time. "Get out of here," he shouted, picking up a branch and waving it at the wolf. The wolf didn't budge. Instead, it took a step closer, its growl deepening. Daniel realized this was his chance. While the man was distracted, he crept backward, using the noise to mask his movements. Once he was far enough away, Daniel turned and ran again, his lungs burning and his legs screaming in protest. He didn't dare look back, his only focus on putting as much distance as possible between himself and the man. The forest began to thin, and Daniel spotted the faint outline of a dirt road ahead. Relief flooded him as he emerged from the trees, his body aching and soaked from the creek. A car sat idling on the road. For a terrifying moment, Daniel thought it might belong to Claire's ex. But as he approached, he saw a familiar figure in the driver's seat. "Gerald," Daniel gasped. The lawyer stepped out, his expression a mix of surprise and concern. "What the hell are you doing out here? Where's Claire?" "She's at the cabin," Daniel panted. "Her ex, he's in the woods chasing me. I needed to lead him away." Gerald's face darkened. "Get in. We're going back." The drive to the cabin was tense, the air heavy with unspoken fears. Gerald's jaw was set, his grip on the wheel tight. Daniel tried to catch his breath, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When they pulled up to the cabin, the sight of Claire standing on the porch with Lila in her arms was a relief beyond words. She ran toward the car as soon as they arrived. "Daniel!" she cried, her voice breaking. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," he assured her, stepping out of the car. "But he's still out there." Claire's expression hardened as she hugged Lila closer. "We can't stay here." "No, we can't," Gerald agreed, stepping out of the car. "We need to finish this tonight." They quickly formulated a new plan. Gerald had contacted the officers who were part of the earlier operation. Reinforcements were on their way to the area, but it would take time for them to arrive. Until then, they needed to hold their ground. "I'm not running anymore," Claire said firmly. "If he comes here, I'll face him." "Not alone," Daniel said. "Agreed," Gerald added. "We'll make sure he doesn't get anywhere near Lila." Claire set Lila inside the cabin, locking the door behind her. "Stay here, sweetheart," she said gently. "Don't open the door for anyone but me or Daniel. Okay?" "Okay, Mommy," Lila whispered, her voice trembling. As the night deepened, they waited. The forest around them seemed alive with movement, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig setting their nerves on edge. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light casting eerie shadows across the clearing. Then, the sound of an approaching car shattered the stillness. "He's here," Claire whispered, her voice tight with fear and resolve. Daniel gripped the tire iron he had taken from the car, his knuckles white. Gerald stood beside him, holding a flashlight in one hand and his phone in the other, ready to call for backup if needed. The black SUV rolled to a stop just outside the clearing. The engine died, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then the driver's side door opened, and Claire's ex stepped out, his imposing figure illuminated by the headlights. "Claire," he called, his voice calm but dripping with menace. "You can't hide from me. Let's end this." Claire stepped out of the cabin, her face pale but resolute. Daniel and Gerald followed closely behind, keeping themselves positioned between her and the towering figure of her ex. The moonlight illuminated the tension in the clearing, casting long shadows that danced across the forest floor. "You're not taking her," Claire said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Her ex chuckled, the sound low and mocking. "I don't think you have a choice, Claire. Lila's my daughter too, and you've kept her from me long enough." "You've done nothing but scare her," Claire shot back. "You don't care about her. You only care about control." The man's expression darkened, his easy smirk vanishing. "Watch your mouth," he growled, taking a step forward. "That's close enough," Daniel said, raising the tire iron. The man stopped, his eyes narrowing as he sized Daniel up. "And who are you?" "Another one of Claire's charity cases." "I'm someone who's not afraid of you," Daniel replied, his voice cold. The tension thickened as the man glanced toward the cabin, his gaze briefly lingering on the locked door. Daniel noticed the flicker of a calculating look in his eyes, and his grip on the tire iron tightened. "You think this is over?" the man said, his tone shifting to one of smug confidence. "It's not. You've always been weak, Claire. You can't protect her forever." Claire's face tightened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she glanced at Gerald, who gave her a slight nod. "That's where you're wrong," Gerald said, stepping forward. "You've already lost." The man frowned, clearly thrown off by the lawyer's calm demeanor. "What are you talking about?" "While you've been busy terrorizing this family," Gerald said, holding up his phone, "I've been documenting everything. Your threats, your actions tonight. All of it. And the officers on their way will be very interested to hear it." The man's eyes darted to the SUV as the faint sound of sirens echoed in the distance. His jaw tightened. "You think I'm afraid of a few cops? They've got nothing on me. They'll have plenty once I hand over the evidence," Gerald said. "Your days of intimidation are over." For a moment, the man hesitated, his posture stiffening. Then his expression twisted into one of rage, and he lunged forward. Daniel reacted instantly, stepping into the man's path and swinging the tire iron. The makeshift weapon connected with the man's arm, sending him stumbling back with a roar of pain. "You little," he snarled, lunging again. This time, Gerald intervened, shining the flashlight directly into the man's eyes, momentarily blinding him. Claire moved quickly, stepping between the chaos and the cabin door, her focus on protecting Lila at all costs. "Enough!" Claire shouted, her voice cutting through the commotion. "This ends now." The sirens grew louder, the flashing lights of approaching police vehicles illuminating the clearing. The man froze, his head snapping toward the sound. Realizing he was out of options, he turned and bolted for the forest. "Stop!" one of the officers shouted as they poured out of their cars, weapons drawn. The man didn't get far. Two officers tackled him to the ground just before he reached the tree line, wrestling him into submission as he struggled and cursed. Daniel lowered the tire iron, his chest heaving as the adrenaline began to subside. Gerald moved to speak with the officers, handing over his phone and explaining the situation in calm, measured tones. Claire stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the spot where her ex had been dragged to his feet and handcuffed. Lila peeked out from the cabin window, her wide eyes filled with both fear and curiosity. "It's over," Daniel said softly, placing a reassuring hand on Claire's shoulder. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "For now," she murmured. The officers spent the next hour gathering statements, piecing together the events of the night. Gerald's evidence proved invaluable, and the man was taken into custody, though not without issuing a string of threats and accusations as he was loaded into the back of a patrol car. Finally, the clearing grew quiet again. The officers left, promising to follow up in the morning. Gerald bid them a weary farewell, his role in the night's events complete. Inside the cabin, Claire sat with Lila on the couch, holding her close. Daniel stood nearby, exhaustion weighing heavily on him. "Thank you," Claire said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Daniel gave her a small smile. "You don't have to thank me. You and Lila deserve to be safe." As the first light of dawn broke over the forest, a sense of fragile peace settled over the cabin. The danger wasn't entirely gone, but for the first time in what felt like forever, there was hope. Claire tucked Lila into bed, whispering soothing words as the little girl drifted off to sleep. When she returned to the living room, she found Daniel sitting by the fireplace, staring into the dying embers. "What happens now?" he asked as she sat beside him. Claire exhaled slowly. "We rebuild. Slowly, one step at a time." Daniel nodded, his gaze steady. "You're not alone, you know. Lila's lucky to have you." Claire gave him a faint smile, her eyes shining with gratitude. "And we're lucky to have you." For the first time in a long time, Claire allowed herself to believe that better days were ahead. The end.